My name is David Major. I'm a retired United States Army Infantry Lieutenant Colonel. My last tour of duty was I was on Marine Corps University Command Staff College faculty advisor. So I was there from 2007, 2009. And then I was offered a job to write a course for the Command Staff Distance Program, which meant I had to retire. And it was about that time anyway. So I retired and worked for the distance program for Command Staff College. And I wrote a course called Operational Art. I did that from 2009 to 2020. And now I still work for College of Distance Education and Training Distance Program. But what I do now is I help other individuals develop courses that we offer to all Marines. And some of these courses are college accredited, so they get college credit. So right now I'm managing about 12 courses, and the courses range from 5-week to 9-week courses on various military topics. So that's what I've been doing for the past year. Yeah, so I guess it will be kind of a volcanic island that's tropical, that's continued to expand. So when I retired from the Army and I started writing an op-art course for the Distance Command Staff Program back in 2009, I started studying design, and I felt that operational design will be appropriate portion of my op art course. So I developed a curriculum, and it wasn't too many formal PME schools that was teaching design at that time. Now, School of Advanced Military Studies, SAMS at Leavenworth, had a design. There's my dog. They had a formal design curriculum, but none of the intermediate level PME schools had one. So I convinced my dean that we need to have some sort of design education. So anyways, I developed a lesson for that curriculum. And each year from 2010, I guess, I kept on adding on to that curriculum. Finally, for my final assessment for my course, I had a design exercise. But, some ideas I got started from SAM, School of Advanced Military Studies. And then the JC put out a joint design handbook. I used some of that. Later on, the Army developed a Army design methodology. I used some of that. There was some independent work from the Marine Corps, contracted to have a design approach, and they kind of used Shimon Nave's Systemic Concept of Operational Design, SOD. I used some of that. Use some of the JSAL's, Bims Valvelson's work, certainly some Ofer's work. So I basically developed my design methodology as it continues to grow. Finally, the Marine Corps developed a Marine Corps design methodology, very similar to the Army design methodology. But I also incorporated some red team techniques into my design methodology and my design approach. So, yeah, continue to expand, very diverse. Yeah, I guess my island would be a tropical volcanic island that continues to expand. So a lot of my design is based off of systems theory. It's not necessarily as the same design approach as some in the industry would do, though that's an appropriate design approach for industry. in developing, architect or designing products, et cetera. But mine is kind of based off of chaos and systems theory. So I would recommend to look at anything, start having a basic understanding of systems theory, chaos theory, look at complex adaptive systems. A good way to kind of look at that is look at evolution and ecology. That is a perfect example of complex adaptive systems and understanding, systems theory. So, books like Fifth Discipline, Black Box Thinking, any other type of ecological books you want to get your hands on. To me, I think that's important for design. Yeah, sure. So I guess it would be my design approach will allow users to organize their thoughts, to come up with a viable solution to deal with a complex problem, and that will facilitate, functional planning. I still work with the Marine Corps. I still work primarily with the Marine Corps University in Command Staff College and the War College. And so, just like Canadian Armed Forces and the Marine Corps and the United States Army, they have their own planning process. And so, I think what's something different between my process and some of my other design colleagues is that I'm not in favor of replacing a service or joint planning process. So what my design approach is basically informs that planning process, which I think is a little bit different from, some of my peers in design, where they just kind of, take a regular planning process and cast it aside and come and have their design approach to address all those. The fact of the matter is that, Marine Corps, Army, Joint Forces, even Canadian Armed Forces, still have to conduct coordinating instructions, troop to task, understand task, be given specific instructions on how to accomplish a certain task. And the Marine Corps plan process, Canadian planning process, Joint Operations plan process, military decision-making process, allows for that. However, on the front end, I don't think it does a good job on addressing the complexities of design of that complex problem. So my design approach that I developed basically facilitates that formal planning process. So that's a big difference, I guess, from me and my other colleagues. Well, I have a couple examples. So strategic, I guess, example, and I don't think design was actually used, but it was very creative. And I probably with Nixon's normalization with China back in the early 70s, I thought that was kind of creative. Basically, we had the Cold War going on with the Soviet Union. Certainly China was an opposing force for the United States. China and the Soviet Union had a border conflict. Nixon saw that, decided to normalize the relationship with China, which kind of divided the Soviet Union in their influence, and kind of changed geopolitics. After that, an operational one could probably be General Slim in his Burma campaign circa 1944 and 1945. I think it's a great example of design. Whereas, he knew that he couldn't necessarily outmaneuver the Japanese forces. There were just better maneuverable forces than his expeditionary force had. But basically, what he did was he took their strength and turned it against them. Took the Japanese propensity and kind of, exploited that. And I think that was a pretty creative design approach. What I do personally, I'm a full-time curriculum developer, but I'm also a part-time farmer. So I certainly use design in my farm and working with nature. And so if you do organic farming, it's very tough if you want to use commercial fertilizers or pesticides. So it's best to kind of use nature and yourself and exploit that as much as you can to kind of grow organically. So yes, I use it on a personal level. But then again, it's all about understanding systems, right? And how systems work, how entities of the systems interact with each other, and that's why I think it's so important in order to be a good designer is understand systems and how the parts of systems work with one another. Well, what excites me about the future, I think as a society, we're always trying to better ourselves. As the arc of history is long, it bends towards justice. So even though there might be some mishaps that's going around the world, I think that we strive to as human beings to self-organize and do the right thing. Another thing of systems theory. So that excites me. What excites me what I'm doing individually as far as when it comes to design. I continue to update my logic on the design approach that I have for the university. I still teach a command staff elective on systems theory. And I'm working on developing a design course to offer to the Marine Corps. Not only that be kept at command staff college, but for other Marines to get on it, to take it. So that's kind of my project I'm working on now. Well, design thinking to me is for military design, right? It's an opportunity to examine a complex social military problem and try to organize your thoughts to develop a possible solution to that. And so, again, my design type of thinking relies heavily on systems thinking, systems theory, chaos theory. Try to understand the nuances, the DNA of the problem set, as well as using some red team techniques. I don't know if you're familiar with red team or not, but it's a way to look critically at a process or a problem and try to alleviate bias in the way you look at it, to determine what that problem actually is, to look at the cause of the problem and not necessarily the symptoms, and to creatively come up with a plausible solution that's acceptable to the propensity of that system. I mean, you could come up with some creative ideas and creative solutions, but if that system's not going to support it, doesn't matter how ingenious you'll get. If it's outside that system, right? So certainly, if you're looking at a complex adaptive system, that complex adaptive system with that problem set is limited in scope, right? So it can only go one or two directions, and it's kind of limited in its capability to expand or contrast. So, if you look at a complex adaptive system of like, where you are in Canada, right? So you guys are in Ontario or Toronto area, basically. Okay, so basically you have a colder climate. And that colder climate has a propensity for a certain flora and fauna to come from that area, right? So certain types of trees and certain types of mammals, certain types of insects. Okay, so that system is temporarily constrained. All right, now that system is not going to convert to a tropical rainforest. All right. Well, that system is not going to convert to a Sahara desert. Okay. So there is some mutations that's going on in that system. Nature is always changing, just like you never step in the same river twice, but has limited capacity to expand. Now, one time, millions of years ago, prior to tectonic plates, certainly Toronto might have supported reptilian, large sized creatures, just like we can find dinosaur bones in Montana. So one time or another, it had that type of environment to support that flora and fauna. But not now, just like Toronto can. It might in another million years, but it's temporarily constrained. So I think the best thing, if you understand that system and know the limits of that system, then you could, come up with a viable solution that will be acceptable. Just like, if you kind of look at United States involvement in Vietnam from, the mid 50s to, 1975, right? So, certainly our goal was trying to create a Jeffersonian democracy, which will be akin to like a tropical rainforest. Certainly with communist involvement, try to take that system to more of a communist anti-West, which might be considered a desert, right? But after a long time, after a while, both those objectives were not supported by the interactions with that system. And what we have now today is a communist capitalist country that's United States' number one ally against expanding China, and is also considered United States their number one trading partner. Now you have to ask yourself how that happened. It didn't necessarily cost 56,000 Americans their lives. However, that system had the DNA for it to kind of evolve that way. And my thing is like understand the DNA of that system, understand its capabilities, what it can and what it can't do, and what's possible, and try to move towards that direction. So I was probably the only one at the university saying we need to have a lesson on this. We need to get in our curriculum. Design was not totally accepted back in the late the last decade of 2000, right? So certainly the IDF introduced design, and it had a kind of a bad release on what happened with Lebanon. However, the United States found itself in a difficult spot in Iraq circa 2005, 2006. And when Sam's kind of introduced Shimon Avé and his new approach to looking at planning, I thought it was kind of was very interesting and intriguing, just because the military decision-making process didn't necessarily deliver. This, in fact, that your first step of that middle decision making process, problem framing or mission analysis, wasn't necessarily asking the right questions when it comes to design. So, design wasn't really acceptable too much. I think a lot of people, thought design was too prestigious, I guess, and that you had to read a certain amount of books and, do these certain things in order to get the street cred for design. And so it didn't necessarily have a positive reception. But I knew there was a gap in our planning. Like, we had to, get in and understand that problem, do some initial, environmental frame and problem frame. So I took what Sam's was doing and what Neve was doing and kind of developed a curriculum. And it got a lot of pushback. Big part of my curriculum was modeling. And in order to understand a complex adaptive system, I think it's appropriate to model it the best you can. And so that got a lot of pushback as well. And so I just told my dean, I said, we need to continue to do this. My reviews, so, I would write a course and that course will go out to about 50 seminars, right? From the East Coast, from Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, all the way to Okinawa. And we would have 50 seminars, 50 different instructors, and where it's about 500 students. And I want to get bad reviews, like students don't get it, this is terrible, and I told the dean we can't do it. We got to sally forward. We got to keep on doing it. And I would continue to update my lesson, update the final assessment, and then finally it snapped on. And now they say, yeah, we need to do this, right? But it basically took the instructors to find utility, right, in design thinking and the systems thinking in dealing with complex problems. And we certainly have examples, that we can go back in history. Vietnam, example number one. What we did initially, probably in Iraq, Afghanistan. We just don't do due diligence and understanding and dealing with complexity, right? We try to take care of the symptom instead of the cause. And certainly design addresses those. So I think just sticking with my belief that we need to add this to our curriculum and just negating what the naysayers would do. Now I would continue to update. If I didn't communicate something properly, I would go there and update the course or make another video to explain a little bit more nuance on a certain design technique or red team technique. But just staying with the program, knowing that the importance of it and how Marines and other servicemen and women could benefit from that type of thinking. Yeah, I don't know if I ever reached a goal. I'm pretty pleased on how I incorporated a design approach in the distance program at the Marine Corps Command Staff College Distance Program, and how that also moved into the resident program as well. So, I'm kind of pleased with that, but you're never satisfied because you're continuing to scrutinize your approach and update and with my friends at the archipelago of design, this is what they're doing and what they're producing and getting ideas from that to, update your product. So I'm just glad that I'm a part of this fine group and be able to share my ideas and my ideas being taught. And we're adaptable species. Sometimes we're our own worst enemies. But, if you do the right thing, follow the science, we're very adaptable. And that's with all complex adaptive systems. In its nature, it wants to self-organize depending on how the environment changes. My curveball comes through it. Mother Nature is a adaptable being. So I think that's why COVID taught us, the propensity to self-organize.